Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Future of XYZ. Today we have Larry Milstein with us to talk about the future of Gen Z. Larry, welcome to Future of XYZ.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat all things Gen Z and, all the kind of future direction of this generation.
Well, it's kind of amazing. I mean, you are Gen Z. Gen Z is defined roughly by born after 95, 96, according to Pew. But I mean, there's so much to dive into because there's a lot of hype in the world, in the consumer world, in the political world, in, the electoral world, whatever, in the activist world about Gen Z. But first of all, like the reason we're talking to you is not just because you are a Gen Z. I had a Gen Z on in a cross-generational conversation in December about the future of careers, and it was pretty enlightening. But you run an agency that stemmed out of your work running Gen Z strategy at Amex after you graduated from Yale. And now you've been running this agency called Prism that really focuses on Gen Z insights, right?
Definitely. So kind of the aha moment I had during my time at Amex was how these large companies, even extremely successful ones, almost had this dearth of understanding around how to connect meaningfully with next gen audiences. And so you're very generous to call me fully Gen Z. I kind of see myself straddling between the millennial Gen Z demo. I was born in 95, so right on the cusp. And it's this opportunity to, essentially bridge that gap between people trying to reach Gen Z and this, audience that, is making waves and kind of leading the charge.
Yeah, well, it's super interesting because obviously having insights is important because, and we should talk about how Gen Z is defined besides the age.
Totally.
Because you are the largest. I'm going to put you in it for now, but I understand
okay, perfect.
because I am born in 77.
Cusper.
And I'm a cusp of Gen X and Gen Y, right? Yeah. So technically Gen X, but a lot of the indicators of the millennials and the older millennials. So I understand that bridging. I think it gives us good insights, right? I mean, it's a strategic mindset from the outset.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's very interesting about this is it's the largest cohort. It's like a third of the world's population.
Yeah.
Right? 1 in 10 American voters in the 2020 election, which is just mind-boggling, to be honest. What other kind of defining qualities, besides the qualities, but also statistically speaking, are we looking at?
So I think it's really interesting because, as you mentioned, you can define Gen Z as a demographic. So as you mentioned, Pew puts it as born in 95 through the mid to late aughts. It's roughly 65 million Gen Zers in the US, 30% of the global population, 2 billion globally. So that's basically the statistical demographic breakdown of Gen Z. What I think I'm more fascinated by is the psychographic profile of Gen Z. At a high level, we were the first generation born when the internet was fully formed, or it's kind of at its current stage today.
You don't remember a world without smartphones.
I'm on the older end and I remember the dial-up tone, but I think people even just a little bit younger than me, pretty much grew up with a smartphone as a core part of their early childhood and adolescence, which I think just fundamentally changes how you view access to information, connection with others, just your relationship to technology. So that's kind of one component. And then you layer on other elements that I think are fascinating, we grew up in the wake of the global financial crisis. We've seen this 24/7 news cycle where we're constantly bombarded with news and updates. We've now seen our early adulthood disrupted with the global pandemic. And so I think when you're thinking about Gen Z, it's really important to go beyond the stats and the numbers and think about kind of the cultural, political, social context in which Gen Z is interacting and has come of age.
Well, I think it's a very important point. And one of the things we want to discuss is how is Gen Z fundamentally different or the same or unique from other generations? And I think about, the context is always important as a strategist, right? And so as Gen X, we were totally disrupted, frankly. I mean, by the .com, crash. by 9/11,
Yeah.
and equally by the collapse in 2008, but not quite so much as the millennials were of that financial crash and the Great Recession. Now,
Yeah.
COVID has completely disrupted what was a pretty smooth sailing looking track for Gen Z. And yet there are these qualifiers or the, you know, that are not attitudinal, that are fundamental, which is like, it's the most racially, ethnically diverse generation ever in the world, right? Most educated. I mean, there are things that are really interesting and powerful that I think is why we all are talking so much about Gen Z. What are you most like excited about, and what gives you interest in this?
Totally. Well, I think as you mentioned, Lisa, like Gen Z is the most diverse, fluid, multi-hyphenate, you know, body positive, breaking down stigmas around mental health, like generation in history. And so I think from that standpoint, as a cohort, it's really fascinating to see how those beliefs can be applied in a political context, in a consumer context, in a tech context. It's these kind of fundamental components of like, what are the core values of this generation? I think even compared to millennials, Gen Z has a much more developed filter. So, you know, I think the stat is like we have an 8-second attention span versus like this 12-second attention span for millennials. And I don't think that means that we're like so, you know, frenetic and our attention is so divided, although that's definitely somewhat the case. But I think what makes us different than earlier generations is our ability to really sift through what's relevant to us versus what is just something we can move forward on. And I think you see that in how algorithms are designed for us with TikTok. It's like you have like 3 seconds to capture our attention before we swipe up. So I think that's just a really fascinating way of which we engage with information consumption and the broader kind of world, internet, and the global environment we're in. The other thing I think is interesting to slightly push back, just because I think that's for the sake of just conversation. Like, I don't know if we really were smooth sailing before the pandemic. You know, I think our lives really, in some ways, have existed on this pendulum where we grew up in this Obama era. You know, I think optimism in the country, but then also saw the rise.
For those of us who see it that way, absolutely.
Sure. Okay. Well, take that apolitically, this sense of progress.
Yes.
But then we also saw, like, obviously the rise of Trumpism. And I think to this metaphor of the pendulum, we saw the legalization of gay marriage, and now obviously in recent weeks, the reversal of Roe v. Wade. I mean, I think this is also top of mind. Like, our lives were bookended by Sandy Hook, you know, being in high school or middle school, and then Parkland and March for Our Lives, and this unified effort, one of the first unified efforts by Gen Z for, you know, social activism. And then this pendulum swinging where even in recent weeks, you know, more horrendous massacres and mass shootings. So I think it's just interesting to think about how we've been navigating through, I think, a very paradoxical world, and trying to make sense of it. And I think social media and the 24/7 news cycle sometimes makes this even more of a just complicated sea to navigate through.
Well, it's really interesting. And I know your business's focus is
Yeah.
really on helping large consumer companies,
Yeah.
you know, kind of cater and sell to 40% of the,
Yeah.
the consuming populace, which is, I think, what the statistic is. But I mean, there is this activism, if you will. I mean, Parkland, to me, I just said, you know, at the time, like, the Dems should just hire the Parkland kids because they can actually create a platform and hold to a message, which the Democrats don't seem able to do. But that's, you know, my own soapbox. Fair. But I think it's true. There has been a lot of tragedy and a lot of hurt. And even if you look at Gen Z GOP, they are more progressive than their older counterparts. So there is this kind of like appreciation, even in what is becomes a 24/7 news cycle, even in what is social
Yeah.
media, which can really choose a rabbit hole and a pathway and
Yeah.
not give you any other points of view. I think what's fascinating about what I'm hearing about Gen Z is how values oriented, how
Yes.
woke, to use a word I hate, but like how
Yeah.
aware and socially conscious, how gender fluid, and yet the mental
Yeah.
health crisis is affecting Gen Z almost more. I mean, it's everywhere, but it's affecting
Yeah.
Gen Z profoundly. Like,
Totally.
how does this, like, what concerns you? I mean, there's a lot of hope in the
Hmm.
future, but what also concerns you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, of course, a lot to be concerned about on like a macro level. I think we talked about this, but we're going to be releasing our very first Prism projections report, which is essentially a kind of crowdsourced report of how Gen Z is feeling from our very own community. And I think the number one thing that was probably most existentially concerning for Gen Z, obviously, is the oncoming climate crisis. To pull like a stat, 68% of Gen Zers surveyed in this report were very concerned about our future in terms of how we're going to exist and persevere through this oncoming climate challenges. So I think to start with what gives me pause or concern, I think that's number one. And then I think from there, there's, I think, an epidemic of loneliness. I'm not sure if social media has entirely, I think it's really fast tracked some of maybe career opportunities or professional opportunities or surface level social connections. But I think there's a larger conversation around addiction and conversations around self-worth that I think social media has definitely had detrimental effects around. So I think that's something that gives me pause. And then I think there's this broader conversation around, I think to your point, like, I think I hate the word like quote unquote cancel culture, because I think that that's thrown around and has become politicized and it's kind of been defanged of any real meaning. But I think Gen Z as a whole is grappling with what does it mean for every single person with a smartphone to be put on a platform as our own public figure? And does every discourse require every single person to have a like talking point on?
Yeah,
Like,
right.
yeah, exactly. So I think that like we as a generation are still setting norms around behavior and how we treat one another on social
No,
and broader. Yeah.
I think that's really important because you guys, as digital natives, really, I think, can in some ways lead the way, and certainly more importantly, shape the future. And so I want to talk a
Yeah.
little for a bit about social media specifically,
Yeah.
because obviously, and I am not shy about being outspoken about how much I hate Mark Zuckerberg and Meta and what they have done to the world. So,
Yeah.
but what's fascinating to me is that the underlying technology and the start of Facebook, then Instagram, which I love Instagram, ironically,
Yeah.
WhatsApp,
Yeah.
a third of the world depends. I think it's a third of the world on
Yeah.
Meta's technology for basic communications, I mean,
Totally.
especially in the developing world. But it seems that Gen Z is moving away from the Meta and into TikTok,
Yeah.
which is Chinese owned, and we're
Yep.
not sure exactly where the data and privacy lands. You have
Yep.
Snapchat. I mean, there are these platforms that exist. I'm sure there are many that I'm not even familiar with. Like,
Yep.
what are the favorites, and are they
Yeah.
evolving and changing? And what are the least favorites? Like, kind of just talked about that for a couple minutes.
Totally. So we actually just did a really exciting project with this global entertainment brand where we talked all about where Gen Z is driving social media, relationships and entertainment habits. And I think one of the most fascinating things for me was you're definitely seeing a shift away from Meta products. Many Gen Zers don't even have an Instagram anymore. Like, that is not even where the social trends are emanating, which is very different from even 5 years ago. I think TikTok is definitely capturing the lion's share of our attention. You're also seeing the way in which they're starting to monetize content, and it's also becoming this point of discovery and e-com. And I think you're seeing this broader shift as eyeballs go to TikTok, and privacy concerns and geopolitical concerns. We'll shelve that for now. But I think to highlight some things that may not be on your listeners' radar, there was a big conversation around this new platform called Be Real. And it's basically this like anti-social media app in some ways, where at any given moment in the day, you receive an alert and you're essentially prompted to take a photo wherever you are, uncurated, unfiltered, like essentially to just be real. And that's gained a lot of traction among Gen Z, because I think people are really sick of the superficiality that people project on social media.
Like
totally. The Instagram face, like I think there's going to be years, decades from now, I think people are going to talk about how we've kind of all morphed into this looking like the same. And I think that Be Real is in some ways a very small antidote and reflects, I think, more than this one specific platform. Who knows if it'll have lasting power, or maybe it'll go the way of Clubhouse. But I think it's this idea of how has Gen Z pushed against this pressure of performativity online, towards finding something that feels a little bit more authentic or real, and that desire. So we'll see kind of where the trend goes, but I think the Instagram aesthetic is starting to fade for real.
That's good. So I want to do a quick round robin on Gen Z attitudes towards ... You ready?
Yes.
Fashion.
Sustainable, circular economy, secondhand.
Awesome. Finance and investing.
Pragmatism, transparency, with a sprinkle of crypto, as we'll see the markets evolve.
Music.
Coming from TikTok, curated on Spotify, almost as like another form of like social media in a lot of ways.
Gender and sexuality.
Fluid, inclusive, defying binaries and categories.
Celebrity.
Celebrity, I think the rise of, that's a tough one. I think we're entering an era where everyone can be a celebrity. And as like Warhol said, I think everyone's going to have this 15 minutes of fame.
Sports. It's not coming up, is it? It doesn't like it doesn't ever come up.
It is.
It's weird.
It is. I think in terms of mental health, actually, like I think that people are supporting athletes saying, "Hey, I need to, step back and prioritize my physical and mental health."
Last one before I ask the last question of the interview.
Okay.
Shopping and brands.
Again, transparency, authenticity, product quality.
Interesting. Cool. Well, thank you for that. I think that the last question I just want to ask is, where do you see this generation? I mean, people talked a lot about, in the 60s, the disruption for the boomers was Vietnam, of course, where, hundreds of thousands of men were getting drafted. The hippie generation became the boomers. Where do we see Gen Z heading in, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years? What do you think and what do you hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't want to start any generational beef, but I think the major difference between boomers and Gen Z is like, I think the boomer hippie generation was extremely idealistic and really focused on these like utopian efforts, and there wasn't really a middle ground to achieving that. I think Gen Z is actually, almost really practical and sometimes maybe to a degree even cynical, but fairly so to a point. And so we do have these strong ideals, but we're also really self-aware of the challenges that I think are going to be the challenges that we're going to face in order to achieve those. So I think, 5, 10, 15 years from now, I think my hope is that Gen Z will really unify around core priorities, as we talked about. I think fighting the climate crisis, continuing to champion rights for LGBTQ people, for women, for people of color. I think these are things that are really intrinsic to Gen Z's values. And then I also think we're going to have a larger conversation around our dependency on technology and media. And so if those elements alongside, I'm sure, a host of other things that are top of mind for Gen Z are things that we can at least improve upon, I would say that we've done a pretty good job.
I love that. Larry, thank you so much for joining us on Future of XYZ today. Good luck. Larry's going to get his MBA at Oxford in the UK in the fall. So good luck there. And thank you again for all these great insights.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was great chatting with you.
And thank you everyone to listening as well or watching. If you don't already subscribe to Future of XYZ, do so on YouTube or anywhere you get your favorite podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at Future of XYZ or visit future-of.xyz to nominate yourself or another person who's equally as interesting to Larry to be a future guest. So thank you again and see you all actually in September.